War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 17, the 30-Year War, States, Nations, and Countries, and the Peace of Westphalia. Okay, why does this follow terrorism? Great question, but you will have to wait until the end. First, we have to talk about the 30-Year War, what led to it, and why the various treaties of Westphalia, identified colloquially and collectively as the Peace of Westphalia, and what's with the pedantic definition of states and nations and countries? I will explain. First, the world's shortest synopsis of the 30-Year War. At first, it was a fairly simplistic insurrection when Emperor Ferdinand II was deposed as King of Bohemia by Frederick V of Bavaria, then generally called the Palatinate. Ferdinand was Catholic, like hardcore Catholic, like Protestants shouldn't exist Catholic, and Frederick was a Protestant. The Czech nobility of Bohemia was largely Protestant and chafed at their Catholic ruler, thus supporting Frederick's usurpation of the Bohemian throne. This was really a continuation of the violence stemming from the Reformation. The initial violence was given a temporary pause by the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which divided, quasi-permanently, lands in the Holy Roman Empire between Lutheran and Catholicism, and formally established the concept of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion, which gave the right of the ruler to establish the faith of his realm, but also recognized the rights of the inhabitants to leave the realm if they were in conflict with the ruler's faith. Freeing the peasant from the land being one of the first means by which the shackles of feudalism began to crumble. An exception to cuius regio was the right of certain Lutheran nobility to retain their religion and their lands, irrespective of the ruler's faith. This was known as the Declaratio Ferdinandae, named after Ferdinand I. Ferdinand II effectively revoked that right from the Bohemians, expelling Lutheran priests from Bohemia and tightly restricting the practicing of Lutheranism in Bohemia. That's a lot to say. This was ostensibly a religious conflict, but far more than that. Frederick's reign was short-lived as the Protestants were defeated at the Battle of White Mountain by Ferdinand's imperial army. As a side note, present at the battle as an observer with the Catholic army was René Descartes. Both armies were largely comprised of mercenaries, albeit ones of corresponding faiths. It was November in Central Europe, and neither army's soldiers had been paid. Prague was the center of gravity politically for Frederick and his Protestants. When Frederick's army, led by Prince Christian of Anhalt, established a defensive position outside the city, Field Marshal Tilly, Ferdinand's commander, simply and wisely went around them. With nothing between the Catholics and Prague, Anhalt force-marched his already grumpy men and established an unavoidable but hastily erected defense on White Mountain. This was not enough. A small reconnaissance in force, a probing action against the flank of the Protestants' position, was enough to cause a retreat. Tilly took decisive advantage of this surprising turn, and the entire position crumbled. Anhalt reinforced his deteriorating position by sending his cavalry, his reserve, led by his son, along with his reserve infantry, but Tilly, too, countered with his cavalry, which proved stronger. When the reinforcing infantry arrived, they saw their cavalry in retreat, and they, too, hastened to flee the battlefield. Broken spiritually before the first rounds were even fired at them. In less than an hour, the battle was over, with 4,000 out of 15,000 Protestants killed or captured, to only 700 lost by Ferdinand's Catholic forces. Frederick had assumed that other Protestant leaders would support him, but they saw no reason to upset the precarious peace that allowed Catholics and Protestants to rule simultaneously and in close proximity. This hesitancy would cost them. Since 1555, the Protestants had expanded their lands under the peace afforded them by the Treaty of Augsburg. The destruction of the Protestant armies in Bohemia afforded opportunity for the Catholics. Maximilian I, who supplied the money to support Ferdinand and Tilly's army, took advantage of the now weakened Protestant forces to expand his control and take Protestant lands in Bavaria. These Central European maneuvers must all be understood in the context of a greater conflict ongoing between the Protestants of James I of England, the Spanish lowlands fighting the Dutch, the growing strength of the Catholic but fiercely anti-Habsburgian French Bourbons, and the fact that while Frederick had stepped a bit too far in Bohemia, he was still the rightful ruler in parts of Bavaria, again what was known as the Palatinate. Mercenary armies dominated, led by mercenary commanders, most famously being Albrecht von Wallenstein. They were paid in various ways, not the least of which was the debased currency which caused runaway inflation, leading to food shortages, exasperated by rampaging armies eating their way through what is now Greater Germany. The commanders of the mercenary armies were paid in soon-to-be confiscated lands, which incentivized the commanders to continually expand the war and create more enemies, more disenfranchised leaders, and more men in need of money willing to fight. All pretensions at simplicity and objectives were gone. At every turn, the fairly fanatical Ferdinand did everything to return Germany to a pre-Reformation Catholic hegemony, which constantly created more and more enemies. The war weakened the Austrian Empire, much to the delight of France and Cardinal Richelieu, who, at every turn, financed and encouraged the Protestant armies to continue the fight. Wallenstein was financed by Spain, hoping that his fighting would weaken the Dutch. This lasted until the Dutch captured the Spanish treasure fleet at Matanzas in 1628, and when the Spanish money dried up, so too did much of their ability to finance the ongoing slaughter in Germany. Sweden jumped into the war when Gustavus Adolphus then engaged in his own war with his cousin Sigismund, who controlled what was then Poland-Lithuania, finally defeated him, and had a continental-based army of some size ready to expand his lands and, probably to a lesser degree, to support his fellow Protestants. The Poles, no longer fighting Swedes, of course then took the opportunity to invade Russia, and instigating what is known as the Smolensk War. Despite his fame, Gustavus's role in the 30-Year War lasted a scant 2 years before he was killed, along with nearly 30% of his men, at the Pyrrhic victory of Lutzen. The Swedes fought on for 2 more years under Axel Oxenstierna, defeating Wallenstein, who was accused and ultimately executed for treason, at the Battle of Oldendorf. But the governor of the Spanish Netherlands, Cardinal Ferdinand III's cousin, managed to raise 11,000 Italians, who, combined with the imperial armies in Germany, and had destroyed the Swedes at the Battle of Nordlingen, which the Protestants were occupying to cut off what was known as the Spanish Road. A quick discussion of the Spanish Road. The 30-Year War took place in the period of the 80 Years' War, when the Spanish Empire was challenged in the Netherlands. There's no clear agreement when the 80-Year War started, and some have simply called it the Dutch Revolt. Regardless, Spain was fighting a counterinsurgency in the Netherlands, and one would think resupply would be by ship from Spain to Holland. In fact, the English, French, and of course Dutch all rejected this, so the Spanish would sail supplies and men to Italy, who would then move these logistics by land to Holland, the Spanish road not being in the Iberian Peninsula at all. Rather, the Spanish road was used by the Spanish. Well, in the greater context during the 30-Year War, the Protestant Swedes saw interdicting the road a great idea, which they did until destroyed at Nordlingen, which is found, by the way, between modern-day Stuttgart and Munich. With this, the combined German and Swedish Protestant armies were exhausted, and the Swedes made the peace with the Catholic imperial armies, and the Germans sought the same, and just when one would think all of Europe would be exhausted, the French, up until now largely removed, save some monetary support to their non-co-religionists, saw their opportunity to pounce, and the 30-Year War, rather than coming to an end, actually expanded into its second phase, far exceeding what was, until now, largely an inter-German religious conflict. Although the fighting continued to be focused in German territory ranging from Saxony in the east, with the Swedes, yet again deeply involved, and attempting to consolidate their gains with their new French allies, there was a far more international flavor, with France and Spain waging war against each other across Central and Western Europe. The near-simultaneous deaths of Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu provided an opportunity for peace, but the success of Richelieu's successor, Cardinal Mazarin, ensured the fighting slogged on. By this point, fighting was secondary to scavenging and feeding the mercenary armies, hugging the rivers for logistical support. Battles raged every few months to inconclusive results. The defeated would do what they could to salvage the survivors and gather enough money and men to attempt to retake what they could. Treaties were signed with independent entities to secure temporary safety, and then those treaties broken just as easily with bribes at the prospect of territorial gains. The battles themselves are tactically fascinating, though strategically irrelevant. One is hard-pressed to find a coherent strategy beyond fighting for annihilation of the enemy's sake. Eventually, the French-Swedish Protestant forces proved superior, and Maximilian, perhaps the man most responsible for the senseless slaughter, finally begged for peace. The 30-Year War was a giant, bloody mess, of which religion, greed, despair, and changing technologies, mostly the introduction of firearms at the individual level and field mobile artillery, caused havoc and chaos, resulting in nearly 30% of the population of Central Europe to be denuded, either by mass migration or death. The fighting ranged from northern Italy to Holland. Naval and land battles fought in Brazil and Africa, where the Dutch allied with various African kingdoms. In the midst of this misery, the greatest killer was bubonic plague. The constant marching of soldiers across Europe dragging the plague, along with typhus and dysentery, to civilian populations. But why discuss the 30-Year War? Because it spelled the end of the feudalistic era due to any number of circumstances. If war is defined between sovereigns, sovereignty at the time could be defined as anyone who could cobble together combat power. Empires and tiny duchies both laying claim. Any amount of might could make right. And the series of treaties which brought it to an end, known collectively as the Treaties of Westphalia, brought about the Westphalian Peace, which established both the concept of the state and the overarching benefit of the state, which is internal affairs are not to be disputed by external actors. Cuius regio, eius religio was reestablished with one key addition. Subjects no longer had to conform or convert to the faith of their ruler. While the tenets of what has been called Westphalian sovereignty were not explicit in the treaties, the results are the same regardless. This concept is carried on to the United Nations Charter, which states, "Nothing shall authorize the UN to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state." Previous to Westphalia, there was an overarching belief that the predominant religious power, often the Holy Roman Emperor, had the moral obligation and legal authority to intercede on behalf of the faith. The Reformation caused a breakup of that 1,000-year-old assumption, which took until Westphalia to finally settle. So the establishment of the sovereign state created a legal structure which is essential to understanding modern war and the nesting of policy and strategy under a sovereign. One reason for the incoherent slaughter of the 30-Year War was the absence of the modern state. No strategy nor policy was truly possible for the belligerents. So a few key words to understand before moving forward. The idea of the sovereign state should be fairly well understood. Often linked to the state is the concept of the nation. These two combined into the nation-state. A nation can be defined as a body of people having a common descent, history, culture, or language. When a state and nation are combined, they provide strength legally and morally, these two legs providing an inherent military strength as well. A state comprised of multiple nations will invariably have internal conflict to varying degrees, as the single sovereign will either have to give up significant internal power to placate the nations, a federal or confederate system similar to the U.S. Constitution and what is seen today in Switzerland, or one nation dominating the others in the internal state, leading to conditions ripe for civil war or secession. The term country is ambiguous and often synonymous with nation-state, but can simply mean territory or even rural, coal country or country living. Departures from the nation-state are inherently destabilizing. When a nation is divided into several states, this can lead to a desire to consolidate into a single nation-state in the form of militant nationalism, Hitler's Germany being the prime example, and Arab nationalism being a more modern example. The instability of the post-World War II era, with incessant subdivisions of previous sovereign states through civil war, secessions, insurrections, and often terrorism, is due primarily to the erosion of the sovereignty of the nation-state. The peace brought by nuclear deterrence squandered in the demand to interfere in the affairs of what was previously sovereign entities and protected by that same nuclear deterrence from being punished for the interference. The terrorism which populated the post-World War II era being the result of both the restraint demanded by nuclear stalemate, as well as the deliberate destruction of the Westphalian peace found in the sovereignty of the nation-state. Which brings us to next week's subject, a case study of terrorism in the post-World War II era. Talk to you next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit. And check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.